and welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, and along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Ray, we decided to do one without a guest, didn't we? You know,
Yes, we did.
That's kind of like how we started this idea. I came up with this idea is that it'd be you and me talking about stories about Oak Ridge and its history and things such as that. And I know you're the master storyteller for those things. You do presentations all the time about stories that have to do with Oak Ridge history. So we thought we'd do one where you could just kind of share some of those stories with us today. So whenever you're ready, you just go right ahead and take it away.
All right. I appreciate your talking about master storyteller. I'm not a master storyteller, but I sure do enjoy telling them. So I don't know what makes one a master, but I have a lot of fun with them. And these stories have seemed to resonate with the audiences that I speak to. And for the last 5 years or so, I've been doing about 40 presentations a year.
Wow.
Around the country, talking about Oak Ridge. I was invited to a roundtable, a private roundtable in Zoom, Colorado, just because of the interest in the history of Oak Ridge. So I'm not sure even yet that people really appreciate the value of the stories that we have here in Oak Ridge. So over the years, I've come to rely on a few key stories that seem to get the audiences interested and get our message across in a kind of unique way. So I'm glad for the opportunity to share those stories here in this forum, Hidden History, the Stories from the Secret City. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll just start through that portion of the presentation that I give to everyone that I have the opportunity to make presentations to.
Very good.
Let's get started here. There we go. And there. And there. I believe that's got us set up. And we'll start with the introductory slide that I use, which is an early evening view of Oak Ridge, the city of Oak Ridge, looking from the summit, looking back toward the Cumberland Mountains. And it's a view that one of the shots I made that I just enjoy. So when I get the opportunity to show it, I do. And I use that as my introduction. Then I begin to talk about the communities that were here before Oak Ridge: Robertsville, Scarborough, New Bethel, Wheat, New Hope, and of course Elza, which is commonly thought of as a community, but actually wasn't. It was just a railroad stop. But I remind them that these were the communities that were here before the Manhattan Project. And I tell them that some of these communities still have annual reunions every year. And we'll pull this in a minute in one of the stories about how I was attending one of those reunions and speaking to them, but we'll get to that in just a moment. This is what the area looked like before the Manhattan Project. This is actually looking from Chestnut Ridge back across Bear Creek Valley at the gap in Pine Ridge where the Scarborough Road comes through. And that house that you see in the foreground is George Anderson's house. The road that runs in front of it is actually the road that's still there today that goes to the east portal of the Y-12 plant. And the Bear Creek Road has been cut in up near to Pine Ridge, the ridge that you can see there now. But this is what the area looked like before the Manhattan Project. Now, it first was called the Kingston Demolition Range. That was changed. It had an ominous sound, so it was changed to Clinton Engineer Works. And I remind people that there's no ing on Clinton Engineer Works. When we talk about it today, the tendency is to add that ing, but it was not there. It was the Clinton Engineer Works. The Army Corps of Engineers ran it, and of course, Oak Ridge was named just for the Black Oak Ridge, the ridge that it's on, just because of other ridges around the area, like Chestnut Ridge, Pine Ridge, all named for trees. So why not name this one for trees as well?
Ray, let me ask you a question there.
All right, sure.
Black Oak Ridge, where is that? Is that up near above Outer Drive? Is that what's considered Black
That's
Oak
it.
Ridge?
Yeah, the ridge that Outer Drive runs along the top of is Black Oak Ridge.
Okay.
And then the city flows on the south side of the ridge down to East Fork Valley, and actually occupies some of East Fork Valley, and the K-25 site's in East Fork Valley. But that ridge that the houses are located on was known as Black Oak Ridge.
Okay.
And that's how they took the name. And the other interesting part that comes in here always is Y12, X10, K25, and S50. What do those code names stand for? And generally, I don't get past this slide without, and I start the presentation telling people to ask questions. So I'm happy to be interrupted for questions. And I rarely even get to this point before they want to know what are those code names. So when we get to this point, I insert the story about the naming of the government sites in Oak Ridge. And I'll tell them that the X10 was the graphite reactor, which is now the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Y12 was the site for the Y12 electromagnetic separation plant, which is now the Y12 National Security Complex. And K25 was the gaseous diffusion plant. And most of them will never have heard of S50. S50, of course, was the thermal diffusion plant located at the K25 site.
And S50 only operated for about what, 90 days, something like that?
It was, yeah, just a few months. The interesting story about S50 is that when General Groves was putting in all of these processes in Oak Ridge, Robert Oppenheimer learned about the Navy experimenting with thermal diffusion. Now, remember, they thought they were in a race with Germany, so they were trying to get this bomb as fast as they could, and they knew that Y12 was slow. It was a process that they knew would work, but it was a slow process. So when they heard about this thermal diffusion plant, Oppenheimer went to Groves and said, look, if we could get a little bit of enrichment to feed into the Y12, that would speed up the process. The hardest part of that separation process is getting from 0.7% up to 1 or 2% uranium-235. So it was a good idea. Also, the K25 site, the gaseous diffusion process, they couldn't get the barrier to work, so they were not able to put the process in as soon as they hoped to. They had already built a steam plant for electrical power, largest steam plant in the world at the time, and it was sitting down there doing nothing. So Oppenheimer told Groves, says, why don't we build a thermal diffusion plant and use that steam out of that steam plant and provide a little bit of enriched feed material into the Y12 Calutron. So Groves said, that's a good idea, we'll do it. He went to the contractor and he asked him, he said, look, I need to build a thermal diffusion plant. I need it built right beside this steam plant, and I need it built in 90 days. The contractor looked at him and said, that's impossible. Groves looked him in the eye and said, you've got 80 days.
Is that right?
Yeah, they built that plant in 76 days. It operated for about 3 months, and it is considered, by calculating the change in the enrichment processes, it's considered that the S50 might have shortened the war by about 3 weeks.
Yep.
So that's the S50 story. Now, again, we're talking about these code names, and I tell them Y12 doesn't stand for anything, and I can't confirm that X10 ever stood for anything, although I've heard some stories about it. But I can tell you that the K25 plant, the K could have stood for the Kellex company, the people that made the gaseous diffusion equipment, and the 25 is known to be a shortcut name for uranium-235. They took the 2 off of the right-hand side of 92, the atomic number for uranium, and they took the 5 off the right-hand side of 235, uranium-235, and they called it 25, just a shortcut name for uranium. And they did the same thing with plutonium. They took the 4 off the right-hand side of 94, the atomic number for plutonium, and they took the 9 off the right-hand side of 239, the isotopic number, and they called it 49. Now, there's a fellow who's written a book in the last few years. His name is Jeremy Bernstein, and he wrote a book called Plutonium, the World's Most Dangerous Material. On the front cover of his book, he has a huge watermark of a 4 and a 9. So he knows the story. Yeah. So K25 might have been named for the Kellex company and the shortcut name for uranium-235. But the rest of the codes, they don't stand for anything. Even General Groves in his book, Now It Can Be Told, when he talks about them, he says, I can't remember where the codes came from, but as far as he was concerned, they were just code names and didn't stand for anything.
Right.
So I talk about then how this place was chosen. It's a rural area close to Norris Dam, inland from the sea, and they were concerned about that at the time. And I say, did General Groves make that decision? He was a quick decision maker, and when he came down here, he got promoted. When he got the job over the Manhattan Project, the first thing he did was cut a meeting short in Washington, hop on a train and come down here to this area because he wanted to get an area, a plant site. He needed something feasible, you know, tangible.
Wasn't that like in September of 42?
It was in September 42, and the first few days he came down, and while he was down here, he decided this is the place. Let's go with it, and he actually issued the order to purchase the land at that point. So did Groves make the decision for choosing this place? Actually, they had already been looking at it all through the summer, and TVA had been out with the predecessor to General Groves, the Marshall, had already been around the area. So they'd already been looking at it. Well, did the president have something to do with it? I don't know, maybe, but also Senator McKellar might have figured into it. When Albert Einstein wrote this letter to President Roosevelt saying Germany's buying up all this uranium ore, and he knew they were trying to build a bomb out of it, Roosevelt knew it would be an expensive undertaking. So he put General Groves in charge of the Manhattan Project. Now, Groves had just finished building the Pentagon, so he knew how to put a large construction project together. He knew how to get private industry involved, and he knew how to spend money. So President Roosevelt also called in Senator McKellar, and he said, Senator, I need to put a large amount of money against the war effort, and I can't let the press or anyone know how much it is or what it's being used for. Can you help me with that? Senator McKellar said, yes, Mr. President, I can do that for you. Just where in Tennessee are you going to put that thing?
And Senator McKellar was our Tennessee senator at the time.
He was our Tennessee senator at
and
the time.
He also was the chair of the finance, I guess, committee for the Senate.
He is. That's exactly right. And he was able to hide that money. An interesting side note here that sometimes I can tell and sometimes I don't, but we'll include it here just because I'm involved with President Truman's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniels, and we've just recently had conversations about when Truman was a senator. He actually was looking into large expenditures, and he found what Senator McKellar was hiding. And actually what happened is, when he started to look into it, Secretary of War Stimson came to then Senator Truman and said, Senator, you don't want to look into that one. Just leave it aside.
Is that right?
Yeah. And of course, when President Truman, later when he was president, he hadn't been told about the Manhattan Project while he was vice president. but
Right.
he learned about it just a few weeks after becoming president. And lots of stories associated with that too. Now that's Senator McKellar's story about how Oak Ridge was chosen is a good story, and an interesting side note again attached to that story is we were able to interview Senator Howard Baker up at his office in Huntsville, Tennessee, up in Scott County. A few years ago, we took a television camera up there, set it up in his office, and put him behind his desk and said, "Okay, Senator, tell us about your connection to Oak Ridge." He said, "First, let me tell you how that place was chosen." And he went into the most flamboyant telling of the story of the Senator McKellar story that you ever heard. And when he got through, I said to him, "Senator, thank you for putting on video the story that I tell everyone who comes to Oak Ridge. Where'd you get that story?" Or he said to me, "Where'd you get that story?" I said, "I got it from Dick Smizer, longtime editor of the local newspaper there, the Oak Ridger." He said, "That's where I got it too."
Is that right? Now, Ray, let me interject here. You're talking about going up and interviewing Senator Baker. As I recall, now this may not have been the same one, but it may have been, is that was the very first Cora interview to be done as part of the Center for Oak Ridge Oral History.
It could, yeah, could have been.
I was scheduled to go do that, and my father passed away. And so I sent Matt Mullins, who we had on our program not too long ago, to videotape that on my behalf. But that interview was the beginning of almost 1,000 oral histories that we've collected over the years.
Yeah,
So,
well, I think you're exactly right, because Matt was with us that day.
yep, yep.
And you're right. That was the start of a really good season of capturing oral histories here in Oak Ridge. That sure was. By the way, Matt has just finished a really good virtual tour of the American Museum of Science and Energy. Saw it posted this morning on Facebook. So,
well, good.
You'll want to check that out. So Senator Baker and I both got that story about Senator McKellar from Dick Smizer. Now, I'll tell you another Senator McKellar story, and I know this one's true because the man that it happened to is still alive today. His name is Lester Fox. He's the patriarch of the Fox automobile dealerships in this area. But in 1942, he was a sophomore in high school at Oliver Springs, a little community just north of Oak Ridge. And he was skipping school. Him and his buddy were playing the pinball machine. When they got through, they were walking down the main street of the little town. They were walking by the telephone office. Telephone operator leaned her head out and said, "Lester, go get the principal. He's got an important phone call." Now, Lester's skipping school, but he does. He goes and goes and gets the principal. Principal comes over and takes that phone call, comes back to the school, calls all the students together in an assembly, and says, "I've just gotten a phone call from Senator McKellar. He wants me to tell you to go home and tell your parents you're going to have to find another place to live. The government's going to take your property for the war effort." Now, Lester swears that's the way these 3,000 people first learned they were going to get off of 60,000 acres in order to make room for the Manhattan Project. Now, many of them didn't have automobiles. They didn't have cars. They didn't have trucks to move their belongings. If they had a car, they might not be able to buy gas for it, tires for it. Those things were rationed. What they did have is young men in the military getting killed. And they wanted to do anything they could to stop that killing and end the war. So they got off their property, many of them in a matter of days, in order to make room for the Manhattan Project. Now, one of those families that had to leave in 1942 was descended from a man named John Hendricks. Now, John was born in 1865, Civil War time, in Bear Creek Valley, where Y-12 is today. In 1900, his youngest daughter died. His wife accused him of being the reason because he'd corrected the child the day before. So she got mad and left him, took the rest of the children, and went to Arkansas and never came back. Now, this really upset John, so he prayed to God wanting to know why this is happening to him. Heard a loud voice during one of those prayers that says, if you'll go sleep on the ground for 40 nights, you'll learn the future of this place. Now, it must have been in the wintertime because, as the story goes, his hair froze to the ground. Now, let me interrupt my story to tell you, I mentioned these little communities that were here before the Manhattan Project, Robertsville, the New Bethel. New Bethel still has their annual reunion over in the New Bethel Church on Memorial Day. And the Wheat, they still have their annual reunion the first Sunday in October at the George Jones Memorial Baptist Church. And the Robertsville reunion, they held it up until a few years ago. But during one of these reunions, I was attending that reunion a few years ago, and I was speaking for them. I was telling this story about the John Hendricks prophecy. And by the time I got to this part about his hair freezing to the ground, this little lady held her hand up out in the audience. I said, yes, ma'am. She said, my grandmother put a quilt on John Hendricks when he was sleeping on the ground and fed him chicken soup because he was about to freeze to death. Now,
right?
you keep that in mind while I finish the rest of my story by showing you a video of the John Hendricks story.
From modest and humble beginnings to secret missions to being one of America's best resources for new technology, these valleys in East Tennessee have a rich and diverse history. We want to honor those who came before us. We want to keep our place in history alive by revealing the secrets of our hidden past. Bear Creek Valley someday will be filled with great buildings and factories, and they will help toward winning the greatest war that will ever be. These words were spoken nearly 40 years before World War II would reach into this peaceful valley, and they were spoken by a man who was considered insane by some, a prophet by others. His name was John Hendricks. At the end of the 1800s, John Hendricks lived with his wife, Julia, and 4 children near where Bull Run steam plant sits today. But then tragedy struck when his 2-year-old daughter died of diphtheria. Because he had recently disciplined the child, his wife blamed John for her death. Julia left John, taking the remaining 3 children with her to Arkansas, and she never returned. Grieving and guilt-ridden, John sought comfort in religion and began praying devoutly. One day, as legend has it, he heard a voice telling him to go into the woods and lay on the ground for 40 days and 40 nights. Heeding the voice's command, John lay down in the forest and prayed for a sign. As temperatures fell, a kind neighbor brought a blanket to warm John's tortured soul and fed him some chicken soup. She had found him barely alive, with his hair frozen to the ground. When John Hendricks finished sleeping on the ground for 40 nights, he had tremendous stories to tell, and he'd tell anyone that would listen. Of course, they thought he was crazy when he was telling these stories, so they put him in a hospital for the insane. He didn't stay long, however, till he escaped, and he told the authorities God's going to destroy that place. Sure enough, his prediction came true in a few weeks when lightning struck the hospital and it burned to the ground. Eventually, John Hendricks overcame his grief and married Martha Jane Gregory, who had 7 children from a previous marriage. John amazed his stepchildren with stories of his visions. He told them that one day cargo would be shipped through the air. Martha rebuked him, saying, "John, you shouldn't have such fool talk."
Mama told me a lot about him. She thought a lot of him as a stepfather. He would have to go off in the woods and get visions, he thought, and come back and tell what he'd dreamed, or anyway, a vision he'd see. It was going to be a big place there one day.
John's most famous predictions centered around the area now known as Oak Ridge and eerily predicted the end of World War II.
There will be a city on Black Oak Ridge. Big engines will dig big ditches, and thousands of people will be running to and fro. They will be building things, and there will be a great noise and confusion, and the earth will shake. I've seen it. It is coming.
John Hendricks died in 1915, so he didn't live long enough to see his predictions come true. He's buried here in Hendricks Creek subdivision in the middle of the city of Oak Ridge. His predictions lived on, however, and serve as a testament to the man who had become known as the prophet of Oak Ridge.
So, Keith, you will also remember that little segment of Grace Crawford that we included there was a oral history interview that I believe you did.
I think I did. It looked familiar.
I think we went down to the retirement center or the senior living center where she was. And you know that lady, she wrote a little book about back of Oak Ridge, and I got a hold of it and included it in the book that I wrote about John Hendricks' story. And she was just delighted that near the end of her life, she was recognized as being an author of that book. We actually had her come up to the American Museum of Science and Energy and set her up as one of the authors, and she enjoyed signing that book. So,
oh, well, good.
It was good. So continuing on with our stories, the next one that I tend to go into is to talk about General Groves and talk about how important he was to the Manhattan Project, just being the right person in the right place at the right time. And I always insert this little comment about the Calyatron girls and how that they were a key to the Manhattan Project. And one of the stories that I use here has to do with Gladys Owens. Gladys is in the lower right. She's that young lady right there. She came back in 2004, and she saw this picture on the wall at the American Museum of Science and Energy. So we took her out to Y12 and set her up, and you'll recognize that location too. That's inside Beta 3, where the Calyutrons remain even to this day, and where you did some video for the Secret City documentary film. Well, this is those same control room that we set her up in and made her picture there. Now, she said to me, she said, "Ray, I never did know what I was doing when I was out there." She worked out there from January until August of 1945. And then after August of 45, when the bomb was dropped, they shut down a lot of the effort out there, and a lot of people left, and she was one of them that left. And she'd never been back to Oak Ridge until she came back in 2004.
Oh, wow.
So she said, "Ray, I never did know what I was doing when I was out here. Can you show me?" I said, "Yeah, Gladys, I can show you." So I reached down there and I opened up one of those cabinets. I said, "Gladys, when you were out here adjusting those knobs, and you were here for 8 hours on a shift, and that's what you did, just a knob to keep a meter on a certain point. If it drifted to a control point, you'd bring it back." She said, "Yeah, Ray, that's exactly what I did, but I didn't know what I was doing." And I opened up one of the cabinets. I said, and I pointed down to the bottom. I said, "Gladys, when you were adjusting those knobs, you were changing the value of this rheostat down here." She reached over and tapped me on the arm. She said, "Ray, I still don't know what I was doing, but I know if I had any bobby pins in my hair, they just go stick to the wall somewhere."
Yeah.
Largest magnets in the world at the time would even pull bobby pins out of the lady's hair. So she, but she didn't, she still didn't know. And I mean, 65 years later at the time, she didn't know what she could talk about or what she couldn't. But all she remembered is those bobby pins would come popping out of her hair if she was near any of those magnets.
Yeah.
And then another one, Ruth Huddleston. Now, Ruth is the third person on the left there. She's the one that's sitting down.
Mm-hmm.
Gladys is up here in the front, but Ruth is sitting down back there. And Ruth is the person that I use now. She's, you know, these ladies are getting up in their 90s. And I used to use 2 or 3 of them, but she's the one that is still able to recollect and able to talk to audiences. And I took her over to University of Tennessee. She talked to over 400 people over there. She has been interviewed by Chris Wallace on the Fox News. You know, he's just published a new book, Countdown to 1945.
Yep.
And when he came down here, I worked with his staff to arrange some of what took place here. He was already involved with her by the time I got involved, but he'd heard about it. But he came down and interviewed her. And when he interviewed her, he talked to her about what she did during the Manhattan Project, of course, but he also learned about her husband, who was her boyfriend at the time. And when Ruth and I do presentations, and we'll do it together, because she gets winded real easy, and I need to interrupt her to give her time to take her breath. And we got a routine that we go through, and we talk about what she didn't know when she was here, of course, just like with Gladys. But also when we get to the part about the bomb being dropped, she has a way of talking about how that impacted her that's most convincing. And we use it. And of course, she used it with Chris and learned about, that's how he learned about her husband and him being in Germany at the time. What Ruth will say is that she didn't know what she was doing, but when the bomb was dropped, they told them, she was at work, they told them that they had been a part of that. So she was proud because she knew that her boyfriend then was in Germany, and she also knew that he was headed next to Japan. So she knew enough about what was going on to know that that would be a good thing if he didn't have to go to Japan, and maybe these bombs would stop there. So she said she was proud of what she'd done. And then she got home that night, she saw the newspaper, and she heard on the news how many people had been killed. And she realized she'd been a part of killing all those people. And she got depressed. She said it disturbed her to the point she couldn't sleep for nearly a week. And she just struggled with that fact that she'd been a part of making a bomb that had killed literally tens of thousands of people. But she eventually decided she'd have to live with that, and that her boyfriend came home. She did get married and went on to a career of being educated at UT and being a guidance counselor in the schools in Morgan County. And she's a delightful lady when she talks about it. The situation has developed since I retired, and actually before I retired from Y12, when new people up at the Department of Energy headquarters, when they would come to Oak Ridge, they would call ahead and say they wanted the person who was coming to meet a Calutron girl. So they would call me, of course, and I'd arrange for it. We'd go out to New Hope Center and have that Calutron girl, or girls, if I could get more than one, have them to introduce themselves to the dignitary that's coming in. One evening, I'll never forget this. I got a call about 9:30 at night saying, "Ray, we need you to have a Calutron girl out in the morning. The Assistant Secretary of Energy is coming down to New Hope. Get them out here." So I said, "Okay, sure, I'll do it." So I called up Peggy Stewart. Peggy was one that I was using at the time. And I said, "Peggy, I need you to be at the New Hope Center in the morning at 9 o'clock. I want you to meet the Undersecretary of Energy or something, whatever, which didn't mean anything to her. She didn't care who it was.
Right.
She said, Ray, Ray, you don't understand. I don't get up till after 9 o'clock. But she did that time. She came out there and we had a delightful time. And another time when the present administrator for NNSA, Lisa Gordon Haggerty, when she came down, it wasn't within a week or so after she'd been appointed, and I got that phone call. So I took Ruth out there, and we were sitting at a table now, just a rectangular table. I was at the end of the table, and the administrator was sitting right beside me, both of us at the end, and then just across the corner of the table, Ruth was sitting beside her. So Ruth and I were doing our standard approach, just like we do with everybody. And we got to the point about her talking about how that impacted her to learn she had killed thousands of people. And the administrator, I was sitting close enough I could see it. And at that time, the administrator began to tear up. And she leaned up and got real close to Ruth and said, Ruth, let me tell you why I understand how you felt. Let me tell you what my job is. And she proceeded to explain to Ruth that her job was to tell the President of the United States that if he needed to use a nuclear weapon, they would go off, they would work. And as she said, we hope that we never have to, but that's my job. Ruth reared back, crossed her arms, and she said, yeah, I know that. And said, I know our president is talking to this man over yonder. Now, this is before they had the summit with North Korea. Yeah. And she said, I know that he's going over there to talk to him. And the administrator said, yes, he is. Said, we've tried everything we can to try to keep North Korea from using those nuclear weapons. And we're going to try a little different approach now. And Ruth reared back again. She said, well, I sure hope they don't get mad. Yeah. And that broke it up. That broke it up. The administrator laughed and said, yeah, I do too. I hope they don't get mad. Yeah. Ruth is a good one though, and she did a good job with Chris Wallace, and that's a good book he's written about the countdown to 1945. So here's what General Groves said about those young girls that were working on these Gallutrons. Now, you and me couldn't say this about women today, but Groves did. We can quote him. Says, above all, I knew the labor supply of East Tennessee was of a very high order from the standpoint of willingness to work. And I knew we had to use many female operators. Tennessee girls would be much more easily trained and would do better work than those of some other sections of the country. The principal reason for this was that the women there were not sophisticated. They hadn't been reared to believe they knew it all.
How funny. Yeah, we couldn't get away with saying anything like that. And Ray, I don't know if you're going to continue on, but one of the other reasons that they decided to use young women instead of, they thought at first they were going to have to use PhDs. And, but they figured that the PhDs would sit there and monkey with it and try to make it better, and they wouldn't get any production out of it. And as long as they could train these young ladies to do that work, they would do what they were told to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Tennessee Eastman Company, who was the company hiring these young girls, and by the way, they sent advertisements out all over the country. They went to high schools and they talked to these young girls. Gladys was living up in Kentucky, and her best friend got a job down here. And she sent Gladys a letter and said, Gladys, you need to come to Oak Ridge and get a job. There's men down here.
There are lots of men.
Yeah, there wasn't any young men up in Kentucky. They were all in the military. But this was a military spot down here, or the plants, or a military site. So they had young special engineer detachment. Young soldiers were here. So so Gladys came down here and got her job. Now, interestingly enough, Gladys, her girlfriend married, but Gladys never did. She was an old maid, And after she'd visited down here, she went back home, and I got a call from the War Stories. What's his name? Oh, the guy that did that, I got to have his name as part of the story. It'll come to me as we're going along. So they wanted to interview a Cayetron girl for that television program, the War Stories. And
Oliver.
Oliver
North. Oliver North.
Yeah. So they wanted to interview a Cayetron girl. And I said, sure, I can connect you with one. So I called Gladys. I said, Gladys, this television program wants to interview you. Can you do it? She said, oh, Ray, I don't feel so good anymore. Said, I don't get out of the house much. Said, why don't you get somebody else? I said, okay, Gladys, I can do that. And right before she hung up, she said, now, who did you say that program was? I said, it's the War Stories with Oliver North. She said, Ollie, I watch him all the time. Would he interview me? I said, I don't know, but I'll call him and see. So I called him back and I said, look, I got you a Cayetron girl. There's only two conditions. One is you got to come to her house in Kentucky to do the interview. And the second is Oliver North has to personally do the interview. If you'll agree to that, she can do it. They agreed to it, came to her house, did the interview, and she called me right after they left and said, Ray, you have made my day. Ollie was here.
Oh, good.
Yeah, but now back to the Tennessee Eastman issue, they could hire these young girls out of high school, but they weren't about to be able to hire enough scientists. Remember, they had 1,152 Cayetrons, and you had to have a girl on each one or somebody on each one. Plus, you had to have operators out in the tank areas and down in the pump areas. So there were 22,482 people working at Y-12 in August of 1945. There ain't no way they could hire enough scientists to run those machines. So when they came to them, the people from out in Berkeley, California was the one pushing for the scientists. They came to Tennessee Eastman and said, look, we're in a race with Germany. We need to get as much production out of these machines as we possibly can. So you're running those young girls on there. You need to put some engineers, scientists on there. Well, Tennessee Eastman said, look, we'll just run a contest to show you. We'll put our girls on one bank of the Cayetrons and you put your scientists and engineers on the other. We'll let them run for a week and we'll see which one's most productive. Well, you know what happened. At the end of a week, the young girls had beat them hands down. Because again, like you said, the scientists and engineers, they would find a little problem and they'd go chase that problem trying to fix it. Whereas the young girls, they knew that they were to keep that meter on a certain spot. And when it drifted to a control point, they were to move it back. Same thing in the other direction. So they were practicing statistical process control without ever knowing it. And the interesting thing is that when they would make improvements in those Cayetrons and they would get better at doing what they were doing, the engineers would change the calculation. They'd put a shunt across that meter so that it would always read that same thing, no matter how much current was going through it. That way the young girls didn't have to adjust to another number. They just had to keep it on that same number all the time. And also they had a red light bulb up at the top of the cubicle. By the way, they didn't call them Cayetron girls back then. They called them cubicle operators. When Gladys came to the Oak Ridge and saw her picture at the American Museum of Science and Energy, Steve Stowe, who was the director of the museum at the time, called me and said, Ray, I've found you a Cayetron girl. Now that's where that term came from.
That term came from.
That's where it came from.
Oh, good.
And they loved, of course, they love to be called that now. And when Denise Kiernan wrote her book about the girls of Atomic City, all of these young ladies that were in there, of course, when she called me wanting me to help her make contact with these women, and I said, sure, I'll be glad to. But all I had to do was introduce her to Colleen Black. Colleen Black did all the rest.
Yeah.
And you know, Colleen and some of those other women, before they passed away, they used to take pens with them and go down to Panera Bread every Friday morning. And people would come by bringing those books that Denise wrote, bring that book by for those ladies to sign. So that was an interesting thing. But anyway, after they had Tennessee Eastman had beat those scientists and engineers, the people from Berkeley went away and let them alone. And they used those young girls right out of high school to operate those Calutrons from then on. Now, I want to end by telling you a couple of stories about Lester Fox. Lester is a jewel of a man. I had him come and speak to ORHPA, the Oak Ridge Heritage and Preservation Association, and tell these stories personally. But I tell them everywhere I go. First of all, you know, he was a sophomore in high school at Oliver Springs, but his older brother had come back from the service and was there. And the two of them decided this is a big deal going on here in Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
Let's buy us some buses. There were 850 buses now in the 9th largest bus system in the nation. And Lester and his brother bought 100 buses. Now, Lester said they created them a bus system, the Fox Bus Company. So he said those buses broke down every day. And one day he was driving a wrecker, and he was over in Clinton, little city just a few miles east of here. And he had one of his buses on that wrecker, tied onto the wrecker and dragging it behind. And he saw another one of their buses broke down. So he just pulled over right in front of that other bus and tied that second one on with a log chain. And then he put the driver back in and said, "You drive it and we'll pull it along." So he pulled it out in the road and pulling two buses now behind that wrecker. And the policeman stopped him, said, "Listen, Lester, you can't do that. Leave one of those buses and come back and get it. And besides, I want you to meet me in the courthouse at 8:30 on Monday morning." Now, Lester worried all weekend about what was going to happen to him when he went to the courthouse on Monday morning. But he went. He walked in there into the hallway, and there stood that same policeman, said, "Lester, come with me." He walked him down the hallway to the clerk's office, took his head in and said, "Give this boy a driver's license."
Yeah, he didn't have a driver's license.
No, Lester was 14 years old when he got his driver's license.
Yeah, and driving a tow truck, hauling two buses at 14.
14 years old. Now, he also said, you know, they broke down every day, so he had to go to Knoxville to get parts for his bus. So he went over there one day, and he got to the parts house, and there wasn't no place to park. I mean, he drove all the way around the square, the block, and came back around, and there still wasn't a parking place. So he just drove his pickup truck right up on the sidewalk, right in the front door of the store. Got out, went in, got his parts, and come back out. And when he come out the door, a policeman was writing him a parking ticket. And he said, no, you can't do that. I'm from Oak Ridge. We're trying to win the war over there. And the policeman tore up his parking ticket.
Is that right?
Lester went back, come back the next day. He didn't even look for a parking place. He just run right up on that sidewalk, parked right in the front door. When he got out, he saw that same policeman writing tickets again. He waved at him. The policeman waved back at him. Lester never parked anywhere else from then on, but right in the front door of that shopping center.
Wow.
But Lester's a good man. He could tell some good stories about what was going on here when he grew up.
That's true.
Another one that's got a lot of good stories is John Rice Irwin. I think of him because I'm now publishing the Historically Speaking in the Morgan County Today newspaper, and I'm running some of the old articles.
Mm-hmm.
So I was putting one together for him last night and came across the one that John Rice Irwin helped me to write about his family. His family was one of the families that had lived up near Norris and had to move because when they were building the Norris Dam, they had to move, and they moved down to Lordston, this town here. It was over in where Emory Valley is now, and they had a 300-acre farm. And John Rice said they had to move out of that in just a matter of days. And his daddy put him on one of the wagons. They were using mules and wagons to move out, and put him on one of the wagons and said, "You stay with the stuff that we're moving over to the new place." And said John Rice said, "I didn't realize that's the last time I was going to get to see that home place."
Yep.
Had to move off. Had to move off quickly.
That's true. That is true.
All right. Let me stop that. And
okay.
get back to stop the share.
There we
Now,
go.
that's got us back.
Here,
And
now we're back.
yeah, some of the stories that I use routinely in talking to people about Oak Ridge. Amazing thing is you can give them the facts, you can state the statistics, and you can use large numbers, and all of that's well and good and impresses researchers and historians. But normal folks tend to love the stories, and they hang on to those stories as hooks to help them to remember the things that are going on with Oak Ridge and the history of Oak Ridge. One more thing, Keith. The most interesting thing that's happening now is that the Secret City documentary film, we put it online, so it's out there and available. Teachers are now using that film, and they're showing it to their students. Mm-hmm. When they show it to them, they'll they'll always pull a piece that has me in it, and they'll tell their students to write down questions about Oak Ridge that you'd like to ask the Oak Ridge historian. And then the next day they'll FaceTime me on my iPhone, and I'll get to talk to those students and answer their questions face to face. That's an amazing use of the technology that's working tremendously well, using the video you produced, the documentary film, and the current technology.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's great that that film and your films that you've done and your publications are being used to tell the story of Oak Ridge to a generation that had never heard it before. So that's wonderful. Ray, thanks so much for sharing those stories, your presentation that you give today. Really appreciate it. I've had a special request, as a matter of fact, and this is something we might want to delve into, is at some point in the future, I had a friend of mine who's a filmmaker, and to be quite honest, probably a little bit of a conspiracy theorist, who asked me about UFOs in Oak Ridge during the 1950s and 60s. And I told him that there are some documents somewhere that talk a little bit about UFO sightings in and around Oak Ridge. So maybe we can do a little digging on that and see what we can come up with, at least an answer or two for him, if you don't know that already.
I don't know that already, but I would be glad to delve into that with you. I think it's a good story. I'll tell you a couple of other things about the 1950s and the start of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. You know, up on Cross Mountain, they put a radar site up on top of that mountain, and they had anti-aircraft guns located strategically around the city of Oak Ridge. Yep. Not only that, they were so concerned that someone would learn of this location and might find a way to get to this uranium. They hid the uranium over in what we call now Katie's Kitchen, which is over on the Walker Creek watershed on the south side of Chestnut Ridge. Yep. They dug a hole back into the ridge and put a storage vault. They called it Operation Dog in 1947. And they put a storage vault back in there where they kept the uranium for a little while. They were just very paranoid about what was being done here, and that someone would learn about it. Oak Ridge wasn't even on a map for 7 years, as you know. Yep. And then even into the 50s and up into the 60s, there was still a lot of concern about how to protect what was going on here. Not a lot being said about it, but a lot being done in the way of radar sites and guns. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if we don't turn up some information about UFOs.
All right.
People were looking into the sky.
That's exactly right. All right, Ray. Well, very good. Thanks for sharing today. We'll do some more of these, just you and me, talking about some of the different stories. I know one I want to do is maybe we can have Mick Wiest on. Mick was a paper boy during the Cuban Missile Crisis and has a unique perspective. And we could talk a little bit about the Oak Ridge and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So maybe those are some ideas of things that we can do in the future. So
I'll do that. You know, we've got Katie Jett coming up next. I'll schedule Mick for the after the next one after Katie. That be
Okay.
all right?
That sounds great. All right,
All right.
Ray. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And folks, thanks for listening. We'll be back again before long.